corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and dust, the kind of smell that never leaves old hospitals. A nurse moved quietly past, her shoes whispering against the tiled floor, while in the far room a child sat on the edge of a metal bed, bare feet dangling, hands folded over a swollen belly that seemed to belong to someone else. Her name was Lena, and she was 5 years old. When Dr. Gerardo Lozada first saw her, he thought the family had come to the wrong department. The girl looked small enough to still need to be carried, her braids tied with bits of ribbon, her eyes wide and calm. But her stomach, round and firm beneath a faded cotton dress, told another story. The mother stood beside her, nervous and silent, repeating that the swelling had grown for months. Some in their mountain village had whispered curses. Others thought it was a tumor. Lozada's first question came out gently, almost unwillingly. "Has she had any pain?" The woman nodded. "Occasional cramps," she said. Strange movement inside. The doctor placed a stethoscope against the tiny abdomen, expecting to hear the dull echo of digestion. What came instead made him freeze, a second rhythm, soft but steady, a pulse inside a pulse. He asked the mother to step outside. The nurse stood by as the examination continued. Everything in his training told him what this meant, yet every instinct rejected it. He pressed again, counted, listened. 2 heartbeats, 1 too many. For a long while he said nothing. He simply stared at the girl, her small hands gripping the edge of the bed, her breathing shallow with worry. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. "We'll need further tests," he said. "Tomorrow morning. Don't be afraid." That night, he wrote a brief note in the logbook. Abdominal distension of unknown origin. He did not write what he suspected. He couldn't. The thought itself seemed like blasphemy. He locked the file in his desk drawer, then sat alone in the dim office, the hum of the ceiling fan the only sound. He had delivered hundreds of babies, but never had the mother looked like a child just learning to read. The following day, he returned with an assistant and an X-ray requisition. The little girl waited in the hallway beside her mother, swinging her legs back and forth. When she saw him approach, she asked softly if the doctor would take the thing out of her. Her mother smoothed her hair and said only that he would make her well. Lozada knelt to her level. "It's going to be all right, Lena," he said. "You'll just feel a flash of light for a second. Nothing will hurt." She nodded, trusting him in the way children trust adults, simply because they must. The radiography room was cold and smelled of chemicals. 2 technicians positioned the heavy plates behind her. She stood still, clutching a stuffed cloth doll someone had given her from the pediatric ward. A bright burst of light filled the room. For a moment, the shape of her small body burned against the glass. Then it was over. When the images developed, the doctors gathered around the drying rack. At first, they saw only shadows. Then, slowly, an outline began to appear. Tiny bones curved like a question mark, a skull faintly visible beneath layers of tissue. Lozada leaned closer. His mouth went dry. It was exactly what he feared and could hardly name. He turned to his colleague and whispered, "There are 2 lives here." The nurse who overheard him wrote it in the corner of her notes and later crossed it out, unsure whether it belonged in medicine or prayer. That evening, the hospital corridors emptied early. Lozada walked the length of the ward twice, his steps echoing softly. In his office, he unfolded the X-ray again under the desk lamp, tracing the faint spinal column inside the ghostly silhouette. He wasn't looking at sickness. He was looking at proof of something impossible. Outside, the city of Lima carried on as always, vendors calling from the streets, carriages clattering across cobblestones, radios humming with distant music. Inside, in a ward meant for children with fevers and broken bones, a 5-year-old girl sat beneath a blanket while the future argued with reason. He could have dismissed it, called it an error, sent her home. But the second heartbeat still echoed in his ears, delicate and persistent. And so he prepared for the next step. Tomorrow, there would be blood tests, hormone panels, consultations. Everything had to be verified, documented, confirmed. Yet deep down, he already knew. What grew inside her was not disease, it was life. He closed his notes and turned off the lamp. The room fell into darkness, except for the faint glow from the X-ray still hanging by the window. 2 silhouettes lingered there, one small, one smaller still, suspended in light. Outside, the wind brushed against the hospital walls, And somewhere down the hall, the child whispered to her mother that the doctor was kind. The mother didn't answer. She only held her daughter close, the way you hold something the world is not ready to believe in. The following morning arrived, gray and cold. The hospital corridors still smelled faintly of antiseptic and fear. Lena sat beside her mother on a wooden bench, her feet not touching the floor, her small hands folded in her lap. Her eyes followed the nurses walking past, their white uniforms fluttering like ghosts. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She just waited, as if waiting was all she'd ever known how to do. Inside the doctor's office, Lozada held the X-rays under the lamp again. The image had dried completely now, clearer, undeniable. He could trace every line of it. The curve of a skull, a faint rib cage, a developing spine. He wanted to believe the film had been mislabeled, that the plates had somehow been swapped with another patient's. But there was only one case taken that day. Only one small girl from the mountains. He called in his colleague, Dr. Bousselot, a man known for his skepticism. The older doctor examined the images in silence, then looked at Lozada with eyes that said everything words could not. "If this is true," he murmured, "then medicine has failed to prepare us for it." Lozada nodded, his throat dry. "It's true," he said. "I heard 2 heartbeats." The 2 men stood there for a long time, the sound of the city muffled behind the thick hospital walls. The X-ray plates glowed like secrets. Every shadow on them was a question without an answer. Outside, Lena's mother clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders. She had come from the mountains of Tikrapo, where superstition traveled faster than medicine. In her village, people whispered that her daughter was cursed. Some said a spirit had entered her while she slept beneath the full moon. Others blamed the gods. The mother didn't believe any of it. She only wanted her child to live. When the doctor returned to the hallway, he crouched down in front of Lena. "We'll have to do another check," he told her softly. "You'll hear some strange noises, but it won't hurt. Do you understand?" She nodded, staring at his white coat with a seriousness that seemed far older than her age. The examination began again, slower, more deliberate this time. A nurse recorded every measurement, every pulse. When Lozada placed the stethoscope to her abdomen once more, he heard the same thing, that delicate, defiant rhythm pulsing just beneath the child's skin. He felt his own heartbeat stumble trying to match it. Later that day, the nurses gathered outside the ward, whispering. News travels quickly in hospitals. Someone had seen the X-rays, someone else had overheard the doctor's hushed conversation. By evening, the entire maternity wing knew. The little girl was carrying a child. The gossip spread like a contagion. Some said it was witchcraft. Others sin. A few, with trembling voices, spoke of things too dark to say aloud. Lozada ordered silence. Every file related to Lena was sealed. He replaced her real name with initials and warned the staff that any word leaking beyond those walls would cost them their license. Still, the whispers continued, softer now, behind closed doors. In the privacy of his office, he wrote a new entry in the case notes. Pelvic maturity consistent with adult woman. Abdominal enlargement equivalent to 28-week gestation. He stared at those words for a long time, unable to believe he had written them. That night, he walked home through the quiet streets of Lima. Streetlights flickered in the fog, and in every window he saw reflections of that X-ray, the glowing bones of a child carrying another child. He wondered if he should have sent for the authorities, but he couldn't. This wasn't a scandal to him. It was something sacred, terrifying, and fragile. The next morning, he returned early. The hospital was still half asleep. The night nurse handed him a note. Fetal movement observed during auscultation. Heartbeat regular. He felt a chill move through him. There was no longer any doubt. What grew inside her was alive and near full term. He assembled a small team of trusted colleagues to confirm what he already knew. They took more X-rays, more notes, more silence. Each film showed the same thing, the tiny fetus, curled and perfect, resting inside the impossible. When the final report was drafted, it was labeled simply, observation to continue until delivery. No mention of her age. No reference to her being a child. The words were clean, technical, as if language itself had to protect them from the horror of what they described. But in every line there was a tremor. The doctors could sense it even as they wrote. This was not just a medical case. It was a wound that no science could heal. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the hospital fell quiet again. In one small room, Lena sat beside her mother, playing absently with the frayed edge of her blanket. Somewhere beneath her ribs, a second heartbeat echoed softly. Not the sound of sickness or sin, but of life that no one had been ready to meet. Lozada stood outside the door, listening, his hand trembling around the stethoscope. He knew what had to come next. Observation was no longer enough. Soon there would be blood, surgery, and questions that no one would dare answer. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered to himself, 2 lives. Then he walked away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the long corridor where medicine met mystery, and both fell, silent. The days that followed passed in sterile stillness. The hospital moved like a clock wound too tight, every click, every shuffle of shoes echoing through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and fear. No one spoke of what was coming, but everyone knew. The nurses exchanged glances instead of words. Even the sound of paper being filed felt louder, sharper, intrusive. Lena's small body seemed too fragile for the world it had been forced to inhabit. The sheets swallowed her frame. When she breathed, the blanket barely stirred. And yet inside her life moved, measured, rhythmic, impossible. The sound of that heartbeat, faint but steady, haunted the night shift. Some nurses said they could feel it, even when the stethoscope was gone, pulsing faintly in the air like a ghost refusing to be unseen. Dr. Lozada's face had grown older in those months. His hair, once neat, now carried strands of gray, and the deep lines near his eyes told of sleepless nights. He documented everything with cold precision: temperature, pulse, fetal activity, his handwriting controlled, almost mechanical. But each time he looked at the charts, he felt as though he were documenting a crime against nature itself. He never used the word miracle. In private, he called it a disruption, something that should not exist but did. He knew science could describe it, but not understand it. In April 1939, the fetus reached what every textbook defined as full term. The heartbeats on the monitor were strong, steady. The child was alive, too alive. The girl's body, barely developed, could not endure natural labor. To wait was to risk both lives. The decision was made. The operation would be performed by dawn. It was to be quiet, unannounced, unrecorded by any journalist or visiting doctor. Only 4 people were authorized to enter the room: Lozada, 2 nurses, and 1 anesthetist. The head nurse sealed the doors herself. The evening before the surgery, Lozada sat in his office for a long time, staring at the old X-rays. The images flickered in the dim lamplight, black and white, grainy, unmistakable. The small skeleton curved within a smaller frame. He had labeled the last one April 28, 1939. Below it he wrote with deliberate slowness, "Mother, 5 years, 7 months." He paused, then placed a final period. That dot, so small, felt heavier than anything he had ever written. Outside, Lima's sky hung dark and breathless. Inside, a child was about to give birth to another. By 5 a.m., the operating room was ready. The metal instruments gleamed under harsh light. The air smelled of ether and fear. The nurses moved with the precision of ritual, arranging gauze, checking sutures, testing the anesthesia mask. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the ticking of the clock sounded reverent, almost guilty. Lena was brought in on a stretcher, her small hands folded over her chest. She was sedated, but awake enough to blink at the lights above her. Her eyes, dark, unblinking, followed the movements around her with quiet confusion. She did not cry. She had learned silence the way others learn language. The anesthetist adjusted the mask gently over her mouth and nose. The nurse murmured a prayer under her breath, half habit, half desperation. Lozada nodded once. The procedure began. The scalpel touched her skin at 8:37 a.m. The incision was small, precise, as if the doctor feared the very act of cutting. Beneath the pale flesh, muscle parted cleanly, and the glint of blood filled the sterile air with its undeniable truth. This was no miracle. This was biology forced to obey cruelty. As the final layer was opened, the uterus appeared, swollen, vascular, the size of an adult's. The contradiction of it stole the air from every chest in the room. No one moved for several seconds. The hum of the sterilizer was the only sound. Then, faintly, so faintly at first it might have been imagined, came the cry. A thin, piercing wail so fragile and yet so complete that it split the silence like glass. The newborn was alive. The nurse stepped forward, trembling, and lifted the tiny body from the incision. The baby's skin glistened, slick and red. He blinked, opened his mouth, and screamed again, a sound that should have been joyous but wasn't. It was too pure for that room. "Male," Lozada said quietly, almost to himself. His voice cracked slightly. Weight, 2.7 kilograms. He handed the child to the nurse, who wiped the blood away with steady hands. They wrapped him in a white cloth and placed him in a small steel crib. He looked healthy, his lungs strong, his limbs perfect. Against all logic, he had survived. For a brief second, the air in the operating room shifted. Relief, disbelief, awe, all mixed into something neither joy nor horror could define. But it didn't last. As quickly as it came, the silence returned. A heavier silence. Lozada turned back to the table. Lena lay still under anesthesia, her chest rising and falling slowly. Her pulse was weak but steady. He began to close the wound. 3 layers. Silk thread. Each stitch tight and deliberate, sealing what the world was never meant to see. At 9:12 a.m., he placed the final knot and whispered, "Done." The nurse checked her vitals. Stable. The anesthetist removed the mask. Her lashes fluttered once, then again. Her lips moved. A faint sound escaped. "Can I go home now?" No one answered. The nurse turned away, pretending to adjust a tray. The words were recorded in the report, not as a question of pain, but as a line of data. Still, they lingered in the room long after she was moved to recovery. Outside, the corridor filled slowly with movement. Assistants, clerks, orderlies. Some wanted to see, others pretended not to care. The whispers spread again. She lived? And the child? Yes, both. No one dared to ask the real question. By noon, the surgery was listed in the daily log under cesarean pediatric successful. Nothing more. The words looked neat, clinical, harmless, like the case itself could be filed away, forgotten. In the recovery ward, Lena lay beneath clean sheets. Her skin was pale, her breath shallow. Beside her bed, the small crib held the newborn, sleeping, his tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with hers. The nurses checked them every hour. Vital signs normal. Both stable. The head nurse wrote a final note. Infant appears healthy. Patient calm. Then, at the bottom, she added one word, almost unconsciously. Mother. She stared at it for a moment, then drew a faint line through it, as though that single act could undo what had happened. Dr. Lozada completed his report later that evening. His handwriting was steady, his tone detached. Successful cesarean performed on female patient, age 5 years, 7 months, infant male, weight 2.7 kilograms, both in stable condition, APGAR satisfactory. He stopped, pen hovering. Then he signed his name and closed the file. He sat in silence for a long time, listening to the faint crying from the nursery down the hall. Somewhere in that sound was the proof of everything science could achieve and everything humanity had failed to prevent. By dusk, the room had been cleaned. The blood was gone, the instruments polished, the linens replaced. The world outside continued as if nothing had happened. But for those few who had witnessed it, the memory would never fade. They had seen something the human mind was not meant to reconcile, a child bearing a child. That night, Lozada returned to his office. He opened the file once more, stared at the date, May 14, 1939, and then locked it away in a steel cabinet. The key turned with a heavy click. He never opened it again. In the corridor, the sound of the newborn's cry echoed faintly against the tile, traveling through the halls like a confession no one wanted to hear. It lingered there long after midnight, a reminder that what had been born that morning was not just life, but history. And somewhere beneath the sterile quiet of that hospital, in the hush between two heartbeats, the world had changed forever. The hospital corridors whispered long after the event was over. Nurses who had once laughed easily now spoke only in murmurs. They carried their trays slower, moved quieter, as if afraid to disturb something invisible still hovering in that room where the impossible had happened. For days, The smell of antiseptic hung heavier than usual. The small operating theater, once an ordinary space for childbirth, became a place people avoided. Some said they could still hear a faint cry echoing through the walls at night, the cry of a newborn who should not have been born that way, through a mother who should still have been playing with dolls. The senior staff tried to move on. Reports were filed. Names were stamped. But paperwork has its own kind of cruelty. It drains the blood from miracles and monsters alike, leaving only lines and numbers. Yet every word on those pages carried a shadow no ink could hide. Within a week, the story leaked. A young orderly had spoken in a cafe, half drunk, his voice trembling between pride and disbelief. "It's true," he swore. The mother was 5. No one believed him, until a nurse confirmed it quietly, her eyes fixed on the table. And then, as if the world had been waiting for something to shatter, the rumor broke free. By the time La Cronica printed its headline, 5-year-old mother gives birth to healthy baby boy, the story had already traveled through 1,000 mouths, changing shape with each retelling. Some called it a divine punishment. Others said it was a hoax. Many refused to believe it at all. The newspapers in Lima filled their front pages with sketches. Some were tender, showing a fragile child with a swaddled baby in her lap. Others were cruel, drawn with the fascination people have for freak shows. Within days, the story reached New York, then London, then Paris. In cafes and lecture halls, doctors debated over it like philosophers dissecting a myth. Some declared it impossible, a violation of nature itself. Others demanded the hospital produce the x-rays, the signatures, the witnesses. Dr. Lozada, the man at the center of it all, tried to remain silent. But his silence only made the noise louder. Soon he was summoned before medical boards and government officials, forced to explain the unexplainable. They questioned his integrity, accused him of fabrication. He stood in those rooms, tired but composed, with his notes spread across the table. He showed them the radiographs, small gray films that revealed a skeletal truth no one wanted to see. The measurements, the calcified fetus, the pelvic bone, everything matched the data. Nothing could be denied, and yet denial was easier. After one long session, an older professor leaned back and said quietly, "Perhaps, doctor, some truths were never meant to be recorded." That night, Lozada went back to his office, locked the door, and sat in the dark. Outside, Lima was alive with noise, traffic, voices, the ordinary hum of life. But in that small room, only the clock moved. He placed his glasses on the desk and whispered, "Then what was I supposed to do? Pretend I didn't see?" The next morning, he wrote the official report for the Peruvian Medical Journal. Just 5 sentences. Gravida y para I, age, 5 years, 7 months. Labor-induced via cesarean. Outcome, favorable. No adjectives. No emotion. Just numbers and words that could fit inside a statistic. It was, perhaps, the only way to survive the truth, by turning it into data. The hospital buried the rest. The child mother was discharged under government protection. A priest, 2 nurses, and an officer accompanied her home. The drive took nearly a day, winding roads through the Andes, where silence lived heavier than snow. When she arrived, her mother wept quietly. Her father didn't speak. The neighbors peeked from their doors but said nothing. Within a week, the family's small home was guarded. Letters and gifts arrived from strangers around the world. Toys, money, Bibles, but most were intercepted and burned. She was told not to speak to reporters. If they came, she was to say nothing, or simply smile and walk away. Her son, a healthy, curious baby, grew quickly, his laughter a strange kind of redemption in a story built on tragedy. When visitors asked who he was, she answered softly, "He's my brother." No one corrected her. Perhaps no one dared. Years passed. The noise faded, as it always does. The world found new stories to be shocked by. The girl grew quieter, taller, her eyes older than her age. By the time she turned 10, she no longer resembled the frightened child in the headlines. She attended school for a while, but left after other children whispered behind her back. Her son, still unaware of his true origin, called her Lena, not Mama. Sometimes she'd look at him playing, and her face would go still, as if remembering something too large for words. In Lima, the case became legend. Medical students studied it like a ghost story written in anatomy books. Professors displayed her X-rays as historical evidence of premature sexual development. Her name was printed in journals across the world, reduced to a footnote in the grand narrative of biology. No one ever wrote about what became of her heart, her fear, her dreams. No one asked how a child survives becoming both mother and myth. Decades later, when journalists tried to trace her life, they found almost nothing. No interviews, no photographs beyond her early years. It was as if she had vanished into the folds of her own silence. One retired nurse, interviewed in her old age, said she remembered visiting Lena once. She was quiet, the nurse recalled. She didn't talk much. But when I saw her with her son, there was peace, like she had accepted it. Or maybe she had forgotten it. I'm not sure which is sadder. By then, the boy had grown into a man. He became a driver for a mining company, living an ordinary life in the highlands. He never knew he was part of medical history. When he died in his 40s, his death went unreported, just another life fading into the dust of Peru. Lena outlived him. In her later years, she refused all interviews. When one foreign journalist finally found her, she turned him away with a single line. The past doesn't belong to me anymore. And maybe she was right, because some stories once told stop belonging to the people who lived them. They belong to history, to whispers, to strangers who turn pain into legend. In the end, the case of the 5-year-old mother remains untouched by time. A scientific miracle, a human tragedy, a moral wound that medicine still doesn't know how to describe. Somewhere in the archives of Lima, her medical report still rests, brittle, yellowed, sealed in glass. It contains all the proof the world ever demanded, but not one line of it tells the truth that mattered most. That a child gave life, and lost her own in the process, not to death, but to silence. And in that silence, history remains complicit.